7:30. So let me mute everybody and unmute the two main mana. There we go. And then ask to unmute and ask to unmute. Okay.
There we go. I'm unmuted.
Yeah, Anthony, you okay there?
I think I'm ready to roll.
Okay. Evening, gents. We've only got 7 at the moment, but as usual, Cape Town style, they will arrive late. But Anthony's very keen to go, and Karel said he's got all the questions all lined. I mean, all the answers all lined up. So shall we con on? Let me get rid of this stop share this thing here, so we can see the main thing. Put it in full screen mode, and off we go. Okay, Anthony, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I think that the latecomers are probably getting in some last-minute heavy drinking and other substances to dull their senses before the president comes on at 8 o'clock, I believe, and not 7 o'clock.
Oh, really? Oh, bugger it. I'm so disappointed.
So I'll assume that we won't have too much of a drop-off at 8 o'clock, but fingers are crossed. Anyhow, as usual, good evening and welcome to another in the series Talking Hi-Fi, brought to you by the Cape Town Hi-Fi Club. And tonight's guest speaks to us from his home in Paarl, which is a town steep in history and, of course, renowned for fine wines. Master amplifier designer and builder Karel Mars is a man who knows a thing or two about vintage interests. His speciality is valve equipment. Now, the thermionic valve or tube was invented more than a century ago in an age when cloud meant something in the sky and stream was a place to collect water or go fishing. Yet, in 2020, it's as clear as ever that valves have an enduring appeal. Some say that valves, like well-structured red wines, are the choice of the true connoisseur. They're only now reaching maturity, and they're capable of being enjoyed well into the future. So Karel, won't you start by giving us an idea of how your audio journey ended up at valves? Over to you.
Hi there, Anthony. Hi, everybody. Well, my journey, how it got to audio. Well, it started at school, and actually even before then, my father was a great lover of music and playing the Beatles and enjoying music and listening to band records. So I realized that if you want to listen to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, he had a copy and none of my friends had. So I enjoyed the sound, and then I remember doing holiday work at the farm next door, painting the cellar at Hofmeyer, Jannie Hofmeyer's farm, Welgemeend. And my payment was a little radio and external speaker. And even though I was pissed off with a small radio, it started, I remember us constructing loudspeakers. And I was at boarding school for high school. So let me just tell me quickly about myself. Born in Paarl, grew up in Klapmuts. Went to Paarl Gymnasium, primary school, high school, went to boarding school. And in the boarding school, connected up with people and met this person, Johan Hamman, who told me about valve amps are important. And we built our own hi-fi amps from Ortona modules, bought from Hammerad in Cape Town. And I was amazed. We basically couldn't afford the Marantzes and the Yamahas of the day. So we built our own. I think that's kind of how I got into DIY and audio. And then passion for music, a love for music. Growing up on the farm, I can remember not having many friends, but the radio on top of the cupboard, the Jonkmanskas, was always playing. And I still think in terms of phrases from songs rather than from profundities from adults. Yes, so that eventually led to going to university for a few years, studying industrial engineering. My father wanted me to get a paying job. It didn't work out. The politics and my personality and being a bit from an anti-authoritarian mindset didn't work so well in the 80s in Stellenbosch at the engineering faculty. But learned a lot about mathematics, studied quite a lot of mathematics, 6 years of mathematics. So I realized that there's no knowledge.
Karel, I'm just going to interrupt there. Was that 6 years because you were really good at it and liked it, or because you weren't very good at it?
I wasn't good at passing critical engineering subjects, but I enjoyed my mathematics. I must say, I don't know why. Probably the abstraction. But after 6 years, they told me I've got to bugger off and go and do national service, and I went to the Air Force and at the radar station. So I actually saw some old radar equipment. And after national service, found myself back in Johannesburg. I had a girlfriend from Pretoria, and which led to me staying in Johannesburg, and went into the audio society. Started walking around Joburg looking for a job, and went to Tom's. They told me about shops in Hillbrow, and I started working in Hillbrow at High Point for 3 years, and I learned how to solder properly and how to fault find. And when I couldn't get a pay raise and I couldn't buy the business, I started my own business in repairs and started taking in valve amps. I've been playing guitar. I'm a mature musician. And already at university, we had our Vox. I had a Vox AC30. And I remember whenever I took it for a service in Rondebosch, it was a mission to take this amp to Rondebosch from Klapmuts and from Paarl. But once I got there, the guy always told me, man, you can fix it yourself. You know, it's very simple. He pointed into the guts and it all looked like a big mess, but he insisted. And then when I found myself in Johannesburg, there was also this Chinaman. I'm trying to think what was his name. But anyway, he was downtown in Johannesburg. He fixed all the boxes. He had piles of the cabinets standing inside. And he also told me, nah, it's simple. Fix it yourself. So when I was at Tom's, I had a temporary, I thought I'd work at Tom's. I knew Benny, and he moved to Braamfontein, and they were the Marshall agents when I was there. He just said, Karel, here's a Marshall amp, it needs fixed, can you do it? And I just said yes. And I just started with common sense. And one thing led to another, and then I noticed nobody really wanted to work on valve amps, and the tubes are hard to find. And when I started my business, I always told people, yes, love to work on it. And I started getting very interesting, ancient vintage gear, and I would redraw the circuits. And the internet started. 1995, well, I would say 1997. I went on the internet. I had a laptop with my 13 stiffies, Windows 95 on, loaded up my Netscape Navigator, and I could find everything I needed to know about valves. It was amazing. No cost. It was all in the public domain. And the combination of being one of the few people prepared to work on amps in Joburg, I mean valve amps, and having all the information available, I thought, yeah, I'll have to build guitar amps. I built some guitar amps, but then I realized...
Paarl, just a quick question then. So was this pretty much your professional user, in other words, performance artists, that sort of amplification? It wasn't domestic, was it?
Yes, yes. Industrial audio was my field of expertise. I found myself servicing nightclubs, musicians, all the audio. So I call it industrial audio.
Okay.
And once I built a guitar amp, I would listen to it. I would listen to it for hours and days. And I noticed that the sound was quite good. Listening to, in those days, it was Radio 2000. Radio 2000 would play non-stop music. And I started looking at building a little stereo amplifier. And I actually built myself a little parafeed EL84 6 single-ended amplifier from transformers that were just lying in the toolbox. And it was a fantastic sound. And I realized I've got to do stereo. And I did some research. I went, I think, to the Johannesburg Technicon and spoke to somebody there, and he didn't really understand it, but he was encouraging, got very encouraging, and he said, yeah, it's got to have a fuse. So we checked, yes, there was a fuse. So that was that. Okay. And yeah, and then I started building amplifiers, and eventually I moved to Paarl again and work on a project. I always knew that somehow it's hard to just build valve amps and make a living from it. So I wanted to do associated skills. So either DIY skills transferal and leaders and a project in Paardenberg here in the Cape. A friend of mine moved to a project, privately funded project with leadership development, and I went there and realized, okay, I'm going to be in the Cape and I'm going to do valve amps full time. And since then, I've been building Mars Cube Audio.
It's Karel, what about some of the high points of that design history? Because clearly there's a long history of leading up to where you started designing yourself stuff that was commercially viable, in which you were doing lots of repairs. But once you actually got it going as an undertaking, what were the highlights of those designs of yours?
Yeah, it can be a long question to long answer, but I would say highlights for me was meeting Wim Bowman, Mr. Valve, in Johannesburg. So he supplied me valves for my amplifiers, for the guitar amps. But whenever I went to him and I said, look, what else have you got lying around here? I usually got a big box of stuff for very little. So I got used tubes. I got chokes. If I ask him, do you have any chokes for sale? He would take out a box. There would be like 20 chokes in. And then I would say, well, can I have them all? And he would say yes. So $500 later, I would have a box of chokes. And eventually I realized, like, so that's a highlight. Having all these parts available, that on a Saturday afternoon you want to tinker, there's parts available. And yeah, and also from him I also got quite a few PAs, Philips PAs. All the factories had to have public address systems, I guess, for fire emergencies by law. And all that was upgraded in the 80s and 90s to solid state. And those items started floating around. And he usually had 2 or 3 of those. So there was a lot of technology available so that I could experiment. So that's one highlight. I guess the other highlight was building that little single-ended amplifier, the parafeed. And then another highlight was when I had to, I usually used output transformers and transformers locally made. And it used to be okay for the guitar amps, but I did some hi-fi kits. I started in 2008, we went to the Hi-Fi Expo in Johannesburg. And I did a kit build. My first kit build was actually at the expo. And we used transformers that were locally sourced, but it turned out the quality was not that high. I had to supply to somebody about 4 sets of transformers. And when I got them, they were not all of the same specification. I was in dire straits. And then I suddenly thought, okay, well, I'll have to roll it myself. I just have to do it. And I got lots of encouragement from everybody, especially on the AV forums. Johan Potgieter was quite supportive. And it was also the world of eBay. You could actually get a transformer winder for 1,500 Rand from eBay. And it was like 4 or 5 days later, it's on the stoop here in Paarl. So it was I think it is the combination of internet and realizing that the things that are hard to find, like tube sockets and tag strips and high voltage capacitors, can be ordered online. And it's a small world when you buy online. It's quickly to your door in Paarl, as quickly as something coming from Cape Town, just about.
Can that be a bit of a stumbling block, really, the lack of ready access to those, which are really quite specialized items?
I think so. Though there is nothing stopping a determined person. But I quickly realized that to recycle used tag strips and tube sockets is a hard one. They have a tendency to break, and they're usually wired in quite tough. So I think it is actually that stops people from exploring vacuum tubes, is the lack of vacuum tube parts. Though theoretically now you can get it. Most of the big shops like RS in Kyalami does supply tube sockets. But I know that it's usually on back order. It's not in the country, it's not available. So I think that is availability of parts. That's why I realized that if I want to tinker with this, I've got to import in bulk.
And you mentioned a word that I think does feature quite a bit in your philosophy, and that is recycling. Do you want to tell us a bit about your views on that, and maybe you can share a couple of experiences if you can remember them?
Yeah. Well, I realized that when I built a guitar amplifier, how much time it actually took to build an amplifier. So if I built an amplifier and something doesn't work on it, then it becomes useless. And all my effort. So you basically, I think I realized that we have a limited life and limited energy. And you don't want to waste your energy. You want to invest it in something that's going to be semi-permanent. So how that, and also I noticed that when I had to build amplifiers, I used a lot of parts, like I told you, that I got from Wim Bowman. It's very expensive to design, to order transformers newly made. And I didn't know that transformers weren't perfect transformers. So they have internal resistance. And whenever I spec'd the transformer for the voltages I wanted, they were always out when I built the amplifiers. And it actually, so I had to recycle. Using recycled parts helped me actually to work with real world values, that once it goes through a tube rectifier and it's got connected to the tube, suddenly the voltages are right. So that's one of the things. And so I think I am precious as a craftsperson. I feel precious about where I put my time and energy. And that's why I think recycling is important. So one of the things is not to lose all this human effort. You know, a vacuum tube has got energy of people who took a lot of trouble to manufacture it. So that's one of the reasons. The other one is I realized that the cost of a part is not necessarily the cost to the planet or to a wider world view. So I became interested in Eastern values, Eastern religion, and the interconnectedness of things, and the my relationship with the world is important. And I noticed that if you mine a piece of metal out of the earth, I can buy like for example, take a glass bottle. I can buy a glass bottle and it's valueless after I've used it. But it doesn't mean it's valueless. A lot of energy was used to create it. And if I break that bottle and throw it away, it kind of loses all of that energy, all that ESCOM energy that we used to fire up the forges and to melt the glass. So part of that, and also part of the reaction, I noticed that the industry was moving to very much prefabricated parts, and a lot of the electronics I was servicing were just about throwaway electronics. A lot of the electronic keyboards were becoming plastic and using only in-house parts, which are hard to find and costly to find at best. So I thought I'd have to design products that I can repair with generic parts that were made all over the world. So I wanted to manufacture things that are recyclable in the sense that if you can change it, or you can strip it and reduce it back to its parts, and those parts should still be useful. So those are the main things, the cost of materials, the real cost, and then the value of human energy and attention.
Okay, and turning to valve equipment specifically now, why in your view is it still that popular, considering that, you know, technologies have changed significantly? There've been solid state devices without number, you know, microchips and whatnot. So what makes valves or tubes still as popular as it is? And in some cases, it seems to be getting more popular.
Yes. No, I would agree with you that they're getting more popular, and it's kind of puzzling. Why would such a bulky, energy-consuming device draw people's interest? But I can tell you, when it comes to music and guitar amps, just about everybody, you don't even have to play guitar. If you, I had a workshop last Saturday, and it's a musician that came to the workshop. And he told me his first time he played on a guitar amp, a valve amp. And that was like a life-changing experience. He never looked back. So once you've heard it when you play guitar, if you hear a guitar sound through a valve amp, there's no going back. So it's ultimate for guitar or music amplification.
But there I have to jump in and point out that, of course, you are talking about the creation of the music. Now, when it comes to the reproduction of the music, surely you want something that's true and faithful to the original, or not?
Well, that's a very interesting, because that's a gray area. Why do vacuum? You can have a solid state amplifier that is completely very low in distortion, and you can have a valve amplifier right next to it that is like a 10% harmonic distortion and just about no headroom. And a lot of people would say the sound that they're getting from the vacuum tube, if I'm thinking of a 300B single-ended amplifier, then that sound is better. So I think it puzzles a lot of people. So how could that be? And I don't really have the answer, but I think it's about the nature of the ear and how we process sound, which I think that's probably different for each person. But, and then there's something about the vacuum tube technology. I've heard strange explanations. Alexander Dumble says, when an electron travels through a vacuum, it's free. Whereas if it travels through a crystal matrix, it's being bumped around. And so
I'm sorry, I'm sure you can see me rolling almost on the floor here, but anyhow.
Yes. So the other explanation is vacuum tubes work at high voltages. They're voltage device. They're voltage-driven devices, work at high voltages. and a solid state or low or current driven devices. So there's a differentiation between valves and solid state. And then another thing, I think, we are organic beings. So we suffer from, or I wouldn't say suffer, but let's say from low frequency oscillations. Constantly, when we look at something, sugar levels are going down and up, oxygen levels are going up. So we are constantly changing, even though we're listening to, say, perfect sound. Our perception is drifting up and down as our biorhythms, if you want, go up and down. And in vacuum tubes, you have similar low frequency drifts. As the vacuum tubes get hotter, the current goes a little bit up. As the current goes up through the tube, the power transformer sags a bit and the voltage goes down. And so you've got all of these drifting things, and that lessens listener fatigue. So I think it reflects more the way that sound in nature sounds to us, where you have varying air density and maybe have reflective surfaces. And that sound is not the perfect sound as you can get from a solid state, say a zero total harmonic distortion amplifier.
Okay, well, look, I'm not particularly going to concern this evening's chat with a discussion between the merits of valve versus silicon. I think that's a discussion for maybe when we have a 2-month-long Zoom chat, but
Yes.
this evening, probably not. I think what I'd like to just touch on now is, you know, DIY, you've mentioned that, and that's a big part of what you do. Now, can you tell us a bit about your DIY workshops, which you hold regularly, and why is there such an interest in it still? And where are your workshops held, and how many can attend? What do they cost? That sort of thing.
Okay. Well, let me think. Why do the workshops? The vacuum tube technology comes from the era just before the modern era, before 1948, 1950. When brand names and the consumer culture wasn't so well established. I will talk about the amplifier right next to me in a moment. So it comes from the era. So vacuum tubes are very much designed. Tube technology is designed for DIY. It is very linear and with very few components you can get, and it's big, far apart. You can use quite a simple soldering iron and make tube technology, and it was widely publicized how to do it. So I guess I'm not a big fan of the modern era I'm talking specifically of the consumerism and the throwaway culture.
Karel, I'm going to interject briefly here just to say that some of you may know, in a previous life, I was involved with that very popular magazine known as Popular Mechanics. And going through the archives, you often came across these, you know, how to build a valve amplifier type of thing, invariably accompanied with a picture of a man and a boy. And the man was clearly the father showing his son. And the other thing about it was that the father was usually wearing a hat and smoking a pipe. Anyway, proceed.
Yes, well, there we go. So that's another thing about the modern world. I think I wanted to create the gap between generations. I have a soft spot for intergenerational contact. I think it's very important that we bring our culture and our values to young people rather than just leaving them to the internet, etc. So one of that's part of the workshops. And I had actually, like last Saturday, I had a father and a son. So there's been quite a few of those attendees. It's a chance for a father maybe whose son is just sitting on YouTube to tell him, like, let's go and spend the whole Saturday sweating away in the sun, building an amplifier. So that's also it. I'd also like to have women at the workshops. So I would really like to have all the bridges or barriers between people removed. Since the parts are hard to find and usually you can't find it from one source, I decided to start putting kits together. And the best way to show people how to build a kit is usually when you sit right next to them and point, because the linear, having to put everything in words and text and writing a manual that's going to explain how to build a valve amp is quite an exercise. So I supply the kits, and then the people can come to the workshops. I do workshops here in Paarl at our workshop here I work from home, so it's in my backyard. And people can come on Saturdays. Typically we do Saturday workshops. It takes about 2 days, but with the leisurely pace, it's more like 3 days. I charge 1,000 Rand a day for a workshop. The kits are ranged between 12,000 and up, whatever you want. You could also custom order a certain kit and I'll assemble it or manufacture it for you. And the amplifier right here next to me is probably our most popular kit amplifier.
Can you hold fire there? I want to do a quick announcement that I've forgotten about, is because you're responding to that question from Chris. And I think I'd just like to point out to the participants, in case you didn't know, if you've got any questions or comments you'd like to make, just feel free to use the chat space on the right. And we'll, of course, have time to interact with Karel afterwards in about half an hour's time, I guess. Orally, of course, without having to resort to chat. Anyway, off we go.
Yes. So obviously, when we spoke about the 1950s era, everything was mono. So I had to innovate in the sense that nowadays everything is stereo. So this amplifier is very much a lot of the information for DIY was published by the tube manufacturers, and Mallard stands out. And they have a fantastic book that is still in reprint. I think it's called something like Build Your Own Valve Amplifiers. And you can find the PDFs, and it's in the public domain. So, and I looked at that. The other 1950s popular DIY amplifier was the Williamson amplifier, but I decided not to do that. It is too complex and too many stages. I wanted to really simplify. So that's why I support, I'm a big fan of the Mallard circuit. And the Mallard circuit, as shown in these early, is absolutely bulletproof. You can't destroy the amp once it's working. Obviously, you can break it by hitting it with a hammer. But I'm talking about even if you have a party, you can this Mallard 510 and the Mallard 520 circuit were extremely reliable. So I decided to do the Mallard circuit, and this is basically what you see here. It's a Mallard type amplifier, and the push-pull amplifier is since the 50s it's the most efficient out of two vacuum tubes. The most power you can get, most efficient way is to use it in push-pull, where the two are 180 degrees out of phase. That's another chat. And there's Wikipedia entries if you want to search on it, why push-pull, or the difference between single-ended and push-pull. Basically, the amplifier is very simple in a thing that you have a power supply unit and you've got one channel and a right-hand channel and a left-hand channel. And the audio goes through only one capacitor in the signal chain towards the speaker. So there's literally sound comes in, volume part, it gets pre-amplified via triode, it gets directly connected to a phase inverter that drives the two output tubes, which are connected to an output transformer connected to a speaker.
So that is an integrated then, and are all your products integrated, or do you do amp only or preamp designs?
Yes, I do. I do power amplifiers, and I do preamplifiers. I do mono blocks, especially mono blocks. You will need a preamplifier.
What's your most popular model or your top seller?
Well, I would say my top seller is on kits. It's called the STA, is a ST70 or a Mars kit 2, Mark II. It's a 35 watt per channel EL 34 driven push-pull amplifier. And this with the octal tubes, these bigger, the bigger amplifiers use bigger tube sockets. And I also went for the preamp. The old 1950s preamps also have the bigger sockets. They're easier to solder. And that has become the most popular amplifier. I think the smaller 10 watt, 15 watt per channel is very nice, but it's a little bit compact, harder to solder. You have smaller tube sockets, smaller tubes, a little bit more tough on the unschooled solderer.
And of course, it needs much more efficient speakers or a smaller listening space, I guess.
Yes, indeed. Whereas this bigger 35 watt, most of your loudspeakers sounds very good.
Are valve watts more powerful than solid state watts then?
Yes, indeed, indeed. Well known. So the basic story was, it works like that. If you have a 1 watt, you can measure watts into a resistor with a meter. And if you have a 1 watt valve amp, will sound louder than a 1 watt solid state amp by a factor of 2 to 3. There's a lot of. And that's puzzling. That's got to be something about how our ears work. I mean, I can't really think of any explanation that explains why that would be.
Well, could it be that something maybe to do with the way that they compress as the volume goes up?
That is probably true. But a 100 watt valve amplifier or a 200 or 300 watt amplifier with a lot of headroom doesn't compress significantly, and still it sounds better than a solid state. So,
well, speaking of things that supposedly sound better, we have a question about output transformerless valve designs, and have you given any thought to that?
Yes, I've thought of that, and those are better for headphones where you have high impedance headphones, 600 ohm and up. I think I looked at some designs, and you need a 32 ohm speaker, a speaker with an impedance of 32 ohm. Otherwise, you need a lot of vacuum tubes. And that is very demanding on each of those vacuum tubes draw high current. These low impedance vacuum tubes like the 6AS7 and the 6080, they draw 2.5 amperes just to heat up the vacuum tubes. And if you put 8 of them in a row so that you can do a 32 ohm speaker, then you've got a lot of heat. Apparently, those are legendary, those OTL, but I have stayed clear from them.
Well, that definitely is one for the connoisseurs, I guess. It's a very niche audience. Just a question about DIY that occurred to me was that, one, tell me about the levels of skill required, and two, what about consistency, or put it another way, what about inconsistency of build, and how do you control that consistency?
Well, that's a rationale for simplicity. Obviously, the simpler something is, the more consistent it's going to be between left and right. But that is a issue, a big issue. I notice it very well. People are very fast to learn. So even in the modern era, we are tool using apes. So our DNA, it's amazing to see how quickly people pick up skills, soldering skills. So the whole idea, if you do DIY, you build an amplifier, the moment your soldering is going to improve over the 2 or 3 days. So if you start on the left channel, the right channel might sound better than the left channel. So, but the fact is you could always revisit. And the electronics is in a way forgiving, even though we don't really know, there's some mysteries in electronics. A soldering joint is a soldering joint. You know, if you pull on it with your hand and it doesn't come loose, then it's probably a good joint. And so it's if you follow if it's done right, it's gonna play. But if the solder joints are cold, it's gonna show up in a year or two. And
well, that brings me to a point that would be very dear to a DIYer's heart. Tell me about tools and equipment that you use and things that you might recommend
yes.
for the average DIYer. You know, clearly we're not talking high-end here.
No. Well, the big thing to know about this type of technology is that the components are extremely robust. So you can apply a lot of heat to them. So you can solder at optimal heat. So what you want is you want to keep your temperature. The solder we use have got resin in it. It's got flux in it. It's inside the solder, and the flux is actually a kind of an acid that makes the solder flow, makes them bind with the metal. And if you have a too hot iron, your flux just disappears into the air before it gets onto the surfaces. So the cheap. So you want a temperature regulated soldering iron. It's your most important tool, apart from your multimeter. So you need to invest in a good solder station, maybe 50 watts upwards, ideally with temperature control, because I work mostly at 300 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So, like I see somebody says, get a Weller. Well, I would say get a Magnum. South Africa, we've got a good manufacturer of soldering irons in South Africa.
And I would say amen to that.
Yes. So that's one of the tools you need. And then you need electronic long nose plier and electronic side cutter. These are not your regular side cutter and not your regular long nose plier. They're a little bit more dainty, and they're cheap. You don't have to buy the expensive ones, and they have a limited lifetime. After a time, they're cutting edges, or the long nose plier, the tips bend. But you need a long nose plier to hold the components when you solder it. Sometimes when it's a difficult spot to get in somewhere. And you also need it to bend the components. If you bend the legs of a resistor, you usually have a plier between the lead and the graphite or the carbon part, so leads don't break off. So that's it. And the side cutter is quite soft, so you can't use it to cut guitar strings and cut blow dry. It's not that type of. You buy a 60 Rand side cutter for electronics. And that's it. If you've got that, it's got a very nice sharp edge. Copper is soft. Those are the tools I find I use the most, apart from screwdrivers and hex and Allen keys and
do you need
spanners.
how serious a digital multimeter does one need to use for doing this kind of work?
I would say the biggest thing is the voltage spec. You need 1,000 volt multimeter, and that will take you out of the cheapest. The cheapest class multimeters can only do up to 600 volts. And if you like the amplifier right behind me, that's running at 450 volts. And when you have a push-pull amplifier, when the one tube goes to 0, the other one goes to 800 volts. So, or if it's 450 volt, 900 volts. So you see, you have to always plan for double your power supply voltages. That gets you close to 1,000 volts. So, but then again, the regular brands, the Korean brands are good. I have found no problem with that. I'm trying to think. I think there's a brand called Unity. There's a brand called Major Tech. And ultimately, the best, if you can get a Fluke, if you can get one in a pawn shop, if you're the lucky guy who walks into a pawn shop and there's a Fluke, get it right there and then. Otherwise, invest in a few $1,000 in a good Fluke multimeter. But the 1,000 volt spec regular types that you get at Mantech or Communica is good.
Excellent. We're getting towards the end of our session now, so I'm going to just wrap up with a few last questions. One in particular, and this relates directly to the things you build and design. How often should one change valves? Or is that how long is a piece of string type of question? That's the first part of it. And the second part is, what's the outlook for continued supply of the really popular valves for audio?
Well, how often should you replace your tubes? That's a tough one. Guitar amps and hi-fi amps are different beasts. The guitar amp guys push them very hard at very high voltages. So I would say if you're a professional musician, you play every weekend and probably once a year. I think about once a year is a number to look at. If you play, I play about 18 hours on my valve amplifiers per day. So if you say 20 hours per day, then in a week you're doing 100 hours over a weekend, maybe more. And that will give you about a year, 2 years of use. If you just
is that irrespective of your power levels or your output level?
That's also a gray area, because you get class A type of amplifiers which are very popular, like this Mallard amp. When this is switched on, it runs at maximum current, just about maximum current. If you were to play at loud levels, it's marginal, the increase in current consumption. So the tubes are working all the time, even if they're playing no music. So those type of amplifiers, it's the amount of hours that you use. So those, if you just listen to music in the evenings, those last forever. The vacuum tubes. You also do get tubes and tubes. You get different manufacturers, and some manufacturers would give you high quality but limited life. Some manufacturers give you long life, but they may be not as good sounding. So you have to. That's also it's a hard question to answer. But I would say in hi-fi, probably 2-3 years, you can look at replacing your vacuum tubes, and with constant listening and constant use, I would say once a year.
And what about the continued supply of those particularly popular valves?
There seems to be no end to vacuum tube technology. According to an article that you can look on the internet, it's called The Cool Sound of Tubes. And a vacuum tube usage has been growing since the 70s at 10% per year, linear growth, irrespective of recessions, irrespective of wars. Germany has started manufacture of vacuum tubes, the L-ROG tubes. So America has started manufacturing vacuum tubes. You can now buy a 300B Western Electric vacuum tube made in America. So looking at those tendencies, you can get tubes from Czechoslovakia. Russia has got a few factories that are still in supply, manufacture, very active. A lot of people prefer Russian tubes to so-called Chinese tubes. China, a lot of factories. I don't know how many factories there are, but I know there's especially one massive one, is Shuguang factory. And then there are some people who actually manufacture by hand. So ultimately, you could even order your handmade vacuum tube. And then we are still depleting stocks from the Cold War era. In the Cold War era, before the discovery of the transistor, all states stockpiled vacuum tubes because they were strategic electronic devices. And when the transistor came, all of that was forgotten about, and it's being recycled and sold on eBay.
Mm. I gather that they were strategic because in the event of a nuclear holocaust, the equipment survived even if the pilot didn't. But that's another question for another day. Just the last couple of things then. How do people contact you should they need to? I know you've got a website, so you want to tell us about that. And finally, if you could just tell us a little bit about what kind of backup you offer kit builders and others.
Yes, so the basic idea is that once you buy a product of mine, you become part of the club. It's not an official thing, but you're welcome to email me anytime or send me a WhatsApp. I have a lot of clients who take photos and send it to me or ask me, they want to add a headphone socket or whatever, or change something about their amplifiers, or how do they measure it when they've got an oscilloscope. So I'm always available for those, though within limits. I find that also it's very disruptive. I basically work with the idea of between 11 and 12, I answer my phone. And the rest of the time, if people leave me WhatsApp or emails, I'll respond to them in the morning or in the evening after work. So that's the backup I give my kit builders. They can also send it back to me. A lot of people build their kits and then courier it to me to if there's some persistent problem they can't find, and I charge by time. So yeah, I'm always there for the product. I basically give a lifetime guarantee on the workmanship and the materials.
Fantastic, Karel. It's been a pleasure. I do have one more question, though. It all started with the music. So tell me, if you have a choice, when you have a choice, what do you prefer to sit down and listen to?
Oh, that's interesting. I would say it's world music. I really enjoy world music, and I love exotic instruments. So I love and that's to me. And then I would say it's probably Motown or Chicago music from the 60s and the 70s. All the Muddy Waters and the soul and the Motown music appeals to me. Those are the big ones, I would say.
Good man. And on that note, thanks again, Karel, for being our guest this evening. As I said, it's been a fantastic trip down memory lane. I've learned plenty. And I can't wait to get started once again on a project like this. I'm now going to open the floor to anybody who would like to engage directly with you and see if there are any questions, comments from our audience. There we go. That's exactly what we want.
Yes, lovely. Anybody's welcome. Here is how you can reach me. There's my website, there's an email address, and you can WhatsApp me on my cell phone number.
Thank you.
Karel?
Chris?
It's Dave.
Oh,
hi, Dave.
Hi. A daft question. When you wire your amplifiers, do you take the wire directly, say, from a capacitor or resistor straight to, say, a valve base, or do you actually bend it through 90 degrees so aesthetically it looks pleasing when you look at the underneath of your amplifier?
I do both, actually, Dave. I don't like those 90-degree bends. I call it the British style. Nothing against the Brits. I also don't really like the American style. I mean, I'm not talking about the war era American style where it looks like spaghetti. If you look in an old Gibson amplifier, So I like a layout to be relatively open so that you can see the components and see the bases. I don't like leads being longer than necessary to follow a rectangular path. But I don't, but I generally prefer to have the components directly soldered. So point to point, I prefer point to point rather than say a turret board technology, especially on the hi-fi. When it comes to guitar amps, it's a different thing. You've got all the vibration, and then you put all the components like on a turret board, similar to Leak uses in their products. And then you have flexible leads from the turret board to the valve bases.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, point to point is the way to go, I think. Yeah. Any other questions?
Karel, last time I looked at your website,
Yes.
you had two, shall I call it, levels of phono stages.
Yes.
So shall I say, the cheaper one uses the smaller valves.
Yes.
Like ECC83 or equivalent.
Yes.
And then the more expensive models uses bigger or larger valves.
Yes.
So what's the difference between the two? What does your larger valve give you?
Yes, that's they have pros and cons. The larger valves have got more microphonics. They're larger elements, and if you bump them, you get more sound coming through your loudspeakers. So they have a tendency to be microphonic, which is what the small tubes don't have. The larger tubes have got larger elements in it, and I don't have the figures right in front of me, and I might stand corrected, but the capacitance. So you've got more capacitance in the larger tubes. So they're not as bright sounding. So I guess on the extreme point, you would say that the older, bigger tubes are more darker sounding, or maybe accentuate the mids. And the smaller tubes would give you less microphonics and be a brighter sound. Though it is a bit of a strange one. There's a famous, I'm trying to think of who is the guy, there's a writer who did a very popular build your own tube amplifiers. I'm not talking about the Mallard book. And this person said that the 6SN7, which is this vacuum tube, the 6SN7 is a octal-based preamp tube, and it's considered the most linear preamp tube. This is a darling of a lot of audiophiles. So I don't know exactly why that is. I know also that if you put components closer to each other, your distortion increases. Whereas if you have the grid further from the cathode, you have less gain, but you have less distortion. So my feeling is also the larger vacuum tubes are probably more linear. So that's probably the audiophile appeal to the larger tubes. But they're not good for mass manufacture because of the microphonics. I don't know how some of the manufacturers do mass manufacturing with the 6SN7. There's not many of them, but I just like the sound of these bigger, older tubes. I think they come from an era when people listened to the technology and adjusted the technology according to their ears, whereas the miniature tubes were more used for anti-aircraft guns and all kinds of devices that are not used for audio. The audio wasn't as important in electronics after the 1940s and especially 1950s. So the audio field diminished as an importance in the manufacture of vacuum tubes. Did
So
I
you were
answer your
speaking
question?
about silver wires. So maybe if you want to, I don't know if
Yes, yes.
you want to tackle that.
Yes, yes. And then somebody mentioned the audio note amplifier. It's probably the, I'm trying to think what is the name of the amplifier, but the famous person who uses it, oh, it's called the Ongaku. Yeah, the Ongaku has got in the secondary silver wire. Silver has got higher conductivity than copper, marginally higher conductivity. I would say silver has got its place. It can be very bright sounding in some amplifiers. So if you have maybe a long signal path using silver, sounds a good idea to me. But I generally am not the one to chase extreme bandwidths. I think our ears start to roll off, you know, at 17 kilohertz if you are lucky and you are young.
Yeah.
So I would roll silver for well-heeled customers. I think it's an expensive way to roll a transformer, and probably only used in the secondary. That's where the biggest losses are. It's the highest current in the output transformer flows in the secondary. I don't really think they would roll thousands of windings of very thin silver wire in the primary. But if that is done, then it becomes quite a precious object. And I don't think you're going to really hear so much. Or you might have to find your super tweeter will be so sharp on your loudspeakers that you'll need to attenuate your loudspeaker tweeters again. So I'm not a big one for silver, but on a request, I will do whatever people want.
Of course.
Yeah, I think there's the cost and the benefit doesn't match. It's a small percentage of improvement for a relatively high cost investment.
Any more questions?
That's fine.
There was one small chat about solid state versus tube rectification. That was the last question.
Yes, tube and solid state rectification. That's an interesting one too, and that also divides between different types of people and how they listen to the music. Vacuum, you can. I find that there's a endless demand. People love tube rectifiers. So all your most expensive vintage amplifier, I think it's the Leak TL12, has got a tube rectifier. So tube rectifiers apparently have less noise than the solid state diodes. Solid state diodes have got what they call shot noise or radio, very high frequency noise when they switch around, when the current turns around and it blocks it. Vacuum tubes don't have that. Vacuum tube rectifiers again have got a high insertion loss. So that means there's a bit more impedance in your power supply. So if you like your music to be punchy and fast, then the vacuum tube rectifier doesn't deliver as well as a solid state power supply. And in solid state, I have to say, you do get diodes and diodes. The hex fret diodes give you a very, very smooth sound. So I would say when I'm talking of comparing the two, I would say, let's talk about hex fret diodes. So if you want a very fast slew rate, steep slew rate or fast sounding amplifier, we're listening to virtuoso music. Tube rectifier has got a lovely sound, especially if you listen to slow music, jazz maybe, or where there's a guitar, not your speed metal, but I'm talking about saxophone and violins have all got slow slew rate sound. Then the vacuum tube is probably a smoother ride.
Right, thank you. Anything else, or should we wind up the session?
Somebody also just asked, just the last word on the soldering irons and working with the biggest thing about but this tube technology is that you got to apply a long duration of heat. I see a lot of people have problems with keeping the soldering iron to the components. But when it comes to vacuum tubes, the components are big, the leads are thick. And I use 1000-volt or 2-watt resistors, and the tube sockets got big pieces of metal. You can hold the soldering iron properly against the contact. So that's one of the things. That's a typical one of the biggest problems I think with DIY tube stuff is that people don't apply enough heat.
Well, they're a bit frightened to apply heat because stuff melts so quick. And, you know,
yeah, well, they melt their transistors. If you work with PC boards, the tracks you're gonna break your PC board.
It'll be very quick,
and your transistors may get damaged.
Yeah.
But a 2-watt resistor, I have not seen a 2-watt resistor damaged by a soldering iron seat. So
it's just practice.
Yeah, I think that's practice. Is to trust, and you need the soldering iron with a blunt, a 2-bit. They call it a chisel bit, a 2mm bit. So when you buy your soldering iron, check if it's got a chisel bit, and if it doesn't, get an extra one. Because the very thin needle bits don't transfer enough heat. It's just too thin, and you don't get a solid solder joint. Well,
true. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anthony, shall we wind up?
Chris, I think that wraps it up for us, and maybe you just will administer the last rites for this evening, and then we can bid each other good night and go off and see what the president has told us, or the nation.
Heavens above. Thank you very much. Thank you, Karel. Very kind. Most interesting.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for everybody for hosting me.
Okay. Bye then.
Okay, chaps.
Thank
We'll see each other in about a month's time. We'll see what happens.
Something like that, yeah. Bye.